In the great archive of the Concord of Stars, on a shelf reserved for species considered settled, safe, and pleasantly dull, there was a file marked Terra. It had not been updated in 11 of their long cycles, and no one in the Concord thought it needed to be. The file said what everyone believed. Humanity had been admitted to the Concord late, after the messy centuries when they had nearly burned their own cradle to ash. They had signed the accords. They had disarmed their orbital weapons. They had accepted a Concord governor and a Concord garrison and a Concord tariff on their exports of grain, art, and the strange resilient fungus that grew only in the ruins of their old cities. They paid on time. They filed their grievances through the proper channels, in triplicate, in the correct dialect of standard, and they never, ever raised their voices. The Concord loved a species like that. Civilized, the assessors wrote. Domesticated, the garrison officers said among themselves, when they were being honest and a little cruel. Earth was a posting you requested when you wanted a quiet decade and a good pension. Nothing happened on Earth. The humans grew their grain and buried their dead and looked up at the sky the Concord had taken from them, and did nothing. That was the great and comfortable error, and it had a name, though no one knew it yet. The name was Kesa Vale. She was 23 years old on the morning. The file was still accurate. She was a junior logistics officer in the Terran Auxiliary, which was the polite Concord term for the human clerks and porters and pilots who kept the garrison supplied without ever being trusted to carry a weapon. Kesa's job was to route grain barges from the northern collectives to the Concord depot at Havenmouth, to reconcile the manifests, and to smile at the Concord quartermaster when he shorted the human collectives their fair return and called it a rounding error. She was good at her job the way a river is good at finding the sea. She knew every barge captain by name and by the sound of their engines. She knew which depot guards could be bribed with human coffee and which had to be flattered instead. She knew the moods of Overseer Thane Corvus, the Concord administrator of the Havenmouth district, the way a sailor knows a coastline that has drowned ships. She was, her supervisor wrote in her review that spring, exceptionally cooperative, a model of the new humanity, destined, if she kept her head down, for a supervisory grade and perhaps a small apartment in the administrative ring with a window. Kesa had read that review and laughed alone until it stopped being funny. Because Kesa Vale kept her head down the way a wolf keeps its head down when it is being fed. She smiled at the quartermaster and memorized his shorting patterns. She flattered the depot guards and mapped their shift rotations. She reconciled the manifests, and, in a second set of ledgers that existed only in her own careful mind, she reconciled the truth. How much the Concord took, how much they returned, how the difference had ground 3 human collectives into famine over the last 4 winters, while the garrison officers dined on imported delicacies and complained the local wine was thin. She had never said any of this aloud. Saying it aloud was how humans disappeared. Everyone knew someone who had said it aloud. There had been a man named Odell, a barge captain, who had stood up in the district assembly 2 winters back and said the word famine in a voice that carried, and the Concord had filed him under a heading called re-education, and no one had seen him since. His barge sat rusting at the Havenmouth pier. Kesa passed it every morning. She had started to think of it as a grave marker. So Kesa did not say it aloud. She wrote it down in the ledger that lived behind her eyes, and she waited, though she could not have said for what. She was young enough to still believe that waiting was a strategy, that the world was a manifest, and if she reconciled it long enough, patiently enough, the numbers would eventually come right on their own. The morning the file was still accurate. The sky over Havenmouth was the pale gold of Terran autumn, and Kesa was arguing with a Concord clerk about a shipment of medical supplies. The manifest says 40 pallets of fever suppressant for the Coldwater Collective, she said, in her flattest, most cooperative voice. The depot has released 4. There's an outbreak in Coldwater. Children are dying of a fever your own physicians could cure with what's sitting in that warehouse behind you. The clerk, a soft-bodied Concord functionary named Prell whose species regulated their body temperature with elaborate fans of skin along their neck, did not even look up. "The other 36 pallets have been reallocated to Garrison Reserve," he said. "Priority adjustment. It's in the system." "It wasn't in the system yesterday." "It's in the system now." Prell fanned his neck flaps, a gesture Kesa had learned meant boredom. "Is there anything else auxiliary?" "You're holding the queue." Kesa looked past him, through the depot's transparent inner wall, at the pallets of fever suppressant stacked to the ceiling in the cool blue light of the reserve store. Enough to save every child in Coldwater 10 times over. Held back, she understood, not because the garrison needed it, but because the collectives had been slow with the autumn grain tithe, and this was the lesson. This was how the Concord taught. Not with executions most of the time, with warehouses, with rounding errors, with children's fevers. "No," she said, "nothing else." She walked out of the depot into the gold morning, and she was shaking, and she made herself stop, because a human who shook where the Concord could see was a human filing themselves under re-education. She went to the barge pier and she found Coldwater's runner, a boy of maybe 15 with the Coldwater Collective's fish scale tattoo on the back of his hand, and she told him the truth. 4 pallets, not 40, and she was sorry, and she would try again tomorrow. The boy nodded like he had expected nothing else. That was the worst part. He was 15 and he had already learned to expect nothing else. That was the morning the file was still accurate. Tara, settled, safe, pleasantly dull, a model of the new humanity, destined for a small apartment with a window. The file stopped being accurate at the reckoning of the harvest, 3 days later, when Overseer Thane Corvus decided to make an example of the Meridian Collective. Nobody in the Concord would ever call it what it was. The official record, filed in triplicate in the correct dialect of standard, would call it a regrettable escalation during a routine compliance action. The garrison log would call it suppression of an unlawful assembly. Corvus himself, in the report he dictated that evening with a glass of the thin local wine he despised, would call it a firm hand, and note with satisfaction that he expected no further trouble from the district for a generation. Here is what it actually was. The Meridian Collective was a farming town of some 4,000 souls on the western shore of the Haven estuary, and it had, that autumn, done a dangerous thing. It had organized, not with weapons which humans were forbidden and which Meridian did not have, with a petition, with a signature drive, with a slow, patient, entirely lawful campaign, run largely by the young people of the collective, to bring the grain tithe before the full district assembly and demand it be recalculated according to the actual accords rather than the overseer's convenient interpretation of them. They had gathered 11,000 signatures from across the district. They had filed them correctly, in triplicate, in the correct dialect of standard. They had scheduled a peaceful gathering in the Meridian Market Square for the morning of the reckoning, to march the signatures to the district assembly hall in full view of the Concord governor, who was visiting from the capital and who might, they hoped, be shamed into fairness by the sheer lawful weight of it. Kesa Vale had helped them. She had done it quietly, from behind her clerk's desk, the way she did everything. She had told the Meridian organizers which channels to file through so the petition could not be dismissed on a technicality. She had warned them which Concord officials to name and which to leave unnamed. She had twice driven out to Meridian in a grain barge under cover of a supply run and sat in a lamplit kitchen with the collective's young counsel and helped them draft their language so that every word was defensible, every claim documented, every demand grounded in the Concord's own law. She had believed, God help her, that lawfulness was armor, that if humanity was perfectly, unimpeachably civilized, the Concord would have no excuse to strike. She had taught them to be civilized, and the Concord killed them for it. It began as she had planned. The morning of the reckoning came up clear and cold, and by the 9th hour the Meridian Market Square held nearly 3,000 people, which was most of the collective and a good number of their neighbors, all of them in their best clothes, all of them unarmed, many of them holding printed copies of the petition over their heads like banners. There were old women and there were infants. There was a choir from the Coldwater Collective who had come to sing the old harvest songs, the ones the Concord had never bothered to ban because they had never bothered to learn what they meant. There was a boy of maybe 15 with a fish scale tattoo on the back of his hand, whom Kesa would later learn had come all the way from Coldwater on a grain barge to be there, because Auxiliary Vale had once told him the truth when she didn't have to, and he had decided that people who told the truth were worth standing beside. Kesa was not in the square. This is a thing she would carry for the rest of her life, that she was not in the square. She was 3 kilometers away at the Havenmouth Depot, arguing about fever suppressant, because she had thought the danger was in the warehouse and not in the sky. Overseer Corvus watched the gathering from the Assembly Hall balcony with the visiting governor at his side, and he saw not a lawful petition but a challenge to his authority in front of his superior, and he made a decision that a firm hand was required. He ordered the square cleared. The garrison commander, a professional soldier who had served on quieter postings, hesitated and asked whether non-lethal dispersal might not suffice for an unarmed crowd. Corvus, who wanted the governor to see decisiveness, overruled him and ordered the garrison's aerial platform to deploy suppression munitions. The platform was designed for war. It had been sitting in orbit over Earth for 11 long cycles with nothing to do, its weapons rated for the armored assaults of species who fought back. It had never once been fired at a human being, because no human being had ever given the Concord a reason, because Earth was settled, safe, and pleasantly dull. The gunnery officer aboard the platform was a young Concord conscript who would, years later, testify that he had asked for confirmation of the order 3 times, and received it 3 times, and that his hands had shaken as he entered the firing solution, and that he had told himself the crowd would scatter at the first warning volley the way any sane crowd would, the way his training assumed a crowd always would. The crowd did not scatter. They had come to be seen. They had come to be lawful in the sight of the governor. When the first pass roared over the square and the warning volley cratered the old fountain at its center, the people of Meridian did not run. They took each other's hands. The Coldwater choir, terrified, kept singing, because the old harvest songs were about exactly this, about standing in the field when the storm comes because the field is yours and the storm is not, and the singing carried up to the platform on the cold, clear air. And the young gunnery officer, who did not understand the songs and never would, followed his orders and fired for effect. It lasted less than 4 minutes. When it was over, the Meridian Market Square, where 3,000 unarmed people had gathered to hand a piece of paper to a governor, was a place the Concord's own cleanup crews would refuse to enter without breathing equipment, and several of them without weeping. The petition copies burned in the gutters. The fountain was gone. The singing had stopped. Overseer Thane Corvus turned to the visiting governor, and the governor, pale, said nothing, and Corvus mistook the silence for approval and went inside to dictate his report about the firm hand, and to note that he expected no further trouble from the district for a generation. He was wrong about that. He was more wrong than any being in the history of the Concord of Stars had ever been about anything. Because 3 kilometers away, at the Havenmouth Depot, Kesa Vale heard the platform fire. She did not know at first what she was hearing. It was a sound Earth had not heard in 11 long cycles, a sound most humans alive had never heard, a long tearing roar out of the north like the sky itself being torn from its seam. Prell the clerk looked up from his fans, mildly curious. The depot guards glanced at each other. Kesa was already running. She ran 3 kilometers. She would never afterward remember running them. She remembered arriving. She remembered the smell before she reached the square, and the silence after, which was worse than the smell. She remembered the cleanup crews holding her back at the cordon, 4 conquered functionaries in breathing masks who did not want her to see, and she remembered that she got past them anyway, because there was nothing in the galaxy at that moment strong enough to hold a 23-year-old human back from that square. She remembered walking into it. She remembered what she found. And she remembered, kneeling in the ruin of the Meridian Market, finding the small, still hand of a boy she knew, with a fish scale tattoo on the back of it, and understanding, in the cold and total way that some understandings arrive all at once and change a person forever, that she had done this. Not the conquered, her. She had taught them to be civilized. She had told them lawfulness was armor. She had helped draft the petition that brought them into that square, unarmed, singing, in the sight of a governor who did not care, in the range of a weapon that had waited 11 long cycles for an excuse. Kesa Vale knelt in the Meridian Market Square for a long time, holding a boy's hand, and she did not weep, though later she would wonder why. She would decide in the end that it was because weeping was a thing you did when there was still something to grieve toward, some future in which the grief resolved. And kneeling in that square, Kesa understood that there was no such future, not the one she had been promised, not the small apartment with the window, not the patient reconciliation of the manifest until the numbers came right on their own. That future had been a lie, and the lie had a shape, and the shape was 3,000 people who had done everything right and been slaughtered for it. When she finally stood, her knees would not straighten for a moment, and the cleanup crews watched her warily, and one of them raised a stunner, expecting her to scream or attack or collapse. She did none of those things. She stood, and she looked at the northern sky where the platform still hung, invisible in the daylight, patient, waiting for its next excuse. And something in Kesa Vale's face made the functionary lower his stunner and step back, though he could not have said why, and would think about it for the rest of his life. The file marked Terra, on its shelf reserved for species considered settled, safe, and pleasantly dull, was no longer accurate. It would be another 2 years before anyone in the Concord of Stars understood that. By then it would be far, far too late. The Concord expected one of 3 things to happen after Meridian. They had seen how domesticated species reacted to a firm hand, and their models predicted 3 outcomes, in descending order of likelihood. The most likely was silence. The collectives would absorb the lesson, lower their heads further, and pay their tithes early for a generation, exactly as Corvus had smugly predicted. The second was a brief, hot, doomed uprising. A few hundred grieving humans would seize farm tools and improvised weapons, storm the Havenmouth depot, and be cut down within a day by the garrison, which would then have full legal cover to expand its powers. The third and least likely was flight. A wave of humans abandoning the Western collectives, becoming refugees, becoming someone else's problem. The Concord had contingency plans for all 3. They had no plan at all for what actually happened, because what actually happened had never happened before, not to them, not to any species they had ever civilized. Nothing happened. For 11 days after Meridian, nothing happened at all. The collectives paid their tithes exactly on time and exactly in full. The barge captains ran their routes. The auxiliary clerks reconciled their manifests and smiled at the quartermaster. There were no riots, no petitions, no funerals large enough to require a permit. The Concord noted the silence with satisfaction and filed Meridian under a firm hand and considered the matter closed. Overseer Corvus received a commendation from the visiting governor, who had recovered his composure on the journey home and reframed the massacre, in his own report, as decisive action against an incipient insurrection. The commendation was the highest error of Corvus's career, though he would not learn that for 2 years. Because the silence was not surrender, the silence was Kesa Vale working. She had not slept the night of Meridian. She had walked back to Havenmouth in the dark, and she had sat at her clerk's desk in the empty depot office, and she had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was reconcile. She had taken out the ledger that lived behind her eyes, and she had begun, coldly, methodically, to reconcile the true account of the Concord's rule over Earth. Not the grievances, the mechanisms, how the tithe worked, how the depots worked, how the garrison was supplied and by whom and through which channels, and where every single one of those channels was staffed, without exception, by human hands. That was the thing the Concord had never understood about domestication, and Kesa understood it now completely, the way she understood the smell of the square. They had made humanity carry everything. Every barge, every manifest, every pallet, every reactor coolant line, every ration shipment, every fuel transfer, every maintenance rotation on the very platform that had fired on Meridian. All of it moved through human hands, because human hands were cheap, and human beings were settled, safe, and pleasantly dull. The Concord garrison of 11,000 functionaries and soldiers sat atop a mountain of human labor, and had never once considered what would happen if the mountain decided to stop being a mountain. Kesa considered it. All night she considered it. And by dawn she had understood that the Concord's entire hold on Earth was not a fortress but a hand around humanity's throat. Yes, but a hand, with fingers, and every one of those fingers was a place where human labor met Concord need, and a hand can be made to open if you break enough fingers at once. But she also understood, sitting there in the gray dawn, the lesson of Meridian, and it was not the lesson Corvus thought he had taught. The lesson was that force met with force gave the Concord what it wanted, an excuse, a target, a firm hand. Meridian had been unarmed and lawful, and they had been slaughtered anyway, yes. But if Meridian had been armed, they would have been slaughtered faster, and the galaxy would have called it justice. A hot, doomed uprising was one of the three outcomes the Concord had planned for. Kesa did not intend to give them anything they had planned for. She intended to give them the fourth thing, the thing with no contingency plan. She intended to make the hand let go. And so in the 11 days of silence, Kesa Vale did not organize an army. She organized a stillness. She began, with the caution of someone diffusing a munition, to reach out, not to the angry, who were easy to find and easy to betray, but to the essential. To the barge captains and the depot loaders and the coolant technicians and the manifest clerks and the ration porters. To the people whose hands the Concord garrison could not survive a single week without. She did not ask them to fight. She asked them a question, always the same question, delivered quietly, in kitchens, in the holds of barges, in the cold before dawn shifts. The question was, what if we simply stopped? Not stopped and rioted, not stopped and marched, just stopped. Every human hand in the district at the same hour on the same day, laying down its work. No violence to give them a target, no assembly to fire on. No weapons to justify a firm hand. Just 11,000 Concord functionaries suddenly discovering that the mountain they sat on had decided, quietly and immovably, to become a void. The first time she asked it of a barge captain named Wren who had lost a cousin at Meridian, the woman laughed at her, a short, ugly, disbelieving laugh, and said the Concord would starve them out, would ship in labor from other worlds, would fire the platform again. All true, Kesa said. All possible. And then she laid out on the captain's own galley table the ledger that lived behind her eyes. How long the garrison's own food reserves would last without the human barges, 19 days. How long it would take the Concord to ship in replacement labor from the nearest world, accounting for jump lag, and the fact that no other species could tolerate Earth's atmosphere without expensive rebreathers that the garrison did not stock. At least 40 days, probably 60. How the platform could fire on a crowd but could not fire on an empty depot, could not fire on a barge that simply never left its pier, could not fire on absence. You cannot massacre a people who are not there, Kesa said. You can only massacre a people who show up. So we will not show up. We will make ourselves absent all at once, and we will let them stand alone on the mountain and discover what it is made of. Captain Wren stopped laughing. By the end of the 11 days, Kesa had asked her question of 40 people, and each of those 40 had begun, carefully, to ask it of others. It spread the way water spreads through soil, invisibly, downward, everywhere at once. It had no leader that the conquered could arrest, because Kesa was careful never to be a leader, only a question. It had no headquarters to raid because it lived in kitchens and barge holds. It had no name at first until the name found it, and the name came from Meridian, from the old harvest songs the Coldwater Choir had been singing when the platform fired. There was a line in those songs, in the old human tongue the conquered had never bothered to learn. We are the field, and we will not be moved. The movement, when it finally had a name, called itself the field. Kesa did not choose the name. The name chose itself, passed hand to hand along with the question, and by the time she heard it spoken back to her in a barge hold 3 weeks after Meridian, it belonged to everyone and no one, which was exactly what it needed to be. She set the date carefully. Not too soon. The field needed to reach every essential hand in the district, and beyond the district, into the neighboring provinces where the collectives had heard about Meridian and were sick with a rage they did not know how to use. Not too late. Grief has a half-life, and a movement built on grief must strike before the grief cools into the old resignation, the old expectation of nothing. She chose the 40th day after Meridian. The conquered, had they known human custom, might have found it significant that 40 was the number in the old songs for the length of a morning, and for the length of a flood. They did not know human custom. They had never bothered to learn. On the 39th day, the conquered garrison at Havenmouth ran exactly as it always had. The barges came in loaded. The depots hummed. The manifests reconciled. Overseer Corvus, freshly commended, spent the day reviewing plans to expand the tithe now that the district had been so thoroughly pacified. He noted with pleasure that auxiliary Vale, that cooperative young clerk, a model of the new humanity, had submitted her manifests early 3 days running, and he made a note to consider her for a supervisory grade. A window, he thought. She'd earned a window. On the 40th day after Meridian, at the first hour of the morning shift, the Havenmouth district went still. It did not go loud. That was the thing that broke the Concord's models that they could never afterward account for in their reports. There was no siren, no signal, no cry. There was simply the absence of the sound they had heard every morning for 11 long cycles. The engines of the grain barges did not start. Along 30 kilometers of the Haven estuary, at every pier, in every collective, the barge captains sat in their galleys and drank their coffee and did not start their engines. The depot loaders did not report. The coolant technicians did not report. The manifest clerks did not report. The ration porters did not report. Kesa Vale did not report. For the first hour, the garrison did not even notice. The morning was quiet, and quiet was normal, and quiet was what a firm hand produced. It was the quartermaster who noticed first at the second hour, when no barge had docked and no manifest had reconciled, and the depot floor stood empty in the cold blue light. He called the labor supervisor, who was human, and got no answer, because the labor supervisor was sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee. He called the barge dispatch, which was human, and got no answer. He walked out onto the depot floor and stood in the enormous silence of it and felt, for the first time in his comfortable career on settled, safe, pleasantly dull earth, a thing he could not name and did not like. By the 4th hour, Overseer Corvus had been informed that no human being in the entire Havenmouth district had reported for work, and that no barge had moved, and that the garrison supply chain, every link of which ran through human hands, had simply ceased to exist overnight. He was not yet alarmed. He was annoyed. He assumed it was a protest, and protests had a shape he understood. He ordered the garrison to identify the ringleaders and arrest them, which was the plan for a hot, doomed uprising, one of the 3 outcomes with a contingency. But there were no ringleaders to identify, because the field had no leaders, only a question that had already been answered. And there was no crowd to fire on, because the humans were not gathered anywhere. They were home, in their kitchens, doing nothing, which is not a crime the conquered had any munition for. Corvus's soldiers went to the collectives and found families eating breakfast. They went to the piers and found barges tied up and cold. They went to the depots and found silence. They arrested a barge captain named Wren, because someone had to be arrested, and Wren looked at the young conquered lieutenant who cuffed her and said, in unhurried standard, "You can arrest me. You can arrest every one of us, but you cannot make us start the engines. That was always the one thing you forgot. You made us carry everything, and you never once asked yourselves what would happen if we set it down." They put Wren in a cell. The engine stayed cold. And 3 kilometers away, in a small apartment that did not have a window, Kesa Vale sat very still and listened to the silence she had built, and understood that the 40th day was only the beginning, and that the conquered, having no plan for a void, would now begin to make the second worst mistake available to it. They would begin to panic. And a panicking power, she knew from her ledger, from the smell of the square, always reached for the same tool. They would reach for the platform. She had planned for that too. The platform could not fire on a void. That was the trap Kesa had built, and it held. On the 5th day of the stillness, Overseer Corvus, sleepless and unshaven and no longer annoyed but genuinely frightened for the first time in his career, stood on the assembly hall balcony and looked down at Havenmouth and understood that he had a weapon that could kill 3,000 people in 4 minutes and no target to point it at. The city was not in revolt. The city was in bed. The barges sat cold at their piers, and the depots stood empty, and the collectives ate their breakfasts, and there was nothing to fire on, no crowd, no barricade, no assembly, only the vast and patient absence of 40,000 human beings who had simply, all at once, set their work down and refused to pick it up. He ordered the platform to fire anyway. The garrison commander, the same professional soldier who had asked, at Meridian, whether non-lethal dispersal might not suffice, refused the order. He refused it in writing, which took courage, because refusing an overseer in writing was a career ending and possibly a life ending. But he was a soldier, and Meridian had broken something in him, and he had spent 4 sleepless nights of his own reading the after-action assessment of the massacre, and he had come to a conclusion that Corvus, in his panic, could not reach. "There is no firing solution," the commander wrote, "for a population that is not assembled. To fire on the collectives now would be to fire on scattered households across 30 kilometers, which would kill perhaps a few hundred and radicalize the survivors and, critically, destroy the very labor force whose absence was the entire problem. You cannot restart a supply chain by killing the workers who staff it. We do not have a military problem, overseer. We have a labor problem wearing the mask of a military one, and the platform cannot solve a labor problem. Nothing in orbit can." Corvus relieved the commander of duty on the spot. It was the last competent officer he had, and he threw him away, and he ordered the platform's gunnery crew to select targets of opportunity along the estuary and open fire. The gunnery crew was still the young conscript who had fired on Meridian, and the 3 others who had served with him. And in the 40 days since the massacre something had happened to them too, something the Concord's models did not track, because the Concord's models did not believe conscripts had interior lives. They had watched the cleanup. They had heard, secondhand, along the whisper networks that run through every garrison in every empire, the line the barge captain had said, "You made us carry everything, and you never once asked what would happen if we set it down." And they had done their own quiet reckoning in the dark of the platform, in the long empty hours orbiting a world that had gone still beneath them. When the order came to select targets of opportunity and fire on scattered human households, the young conscript did a thing he had not known he was capable of. He asked for confirmation of the order. He received it. He asked a second time. He received it. He asked a third time, and this was the thing the Concord's models could never have predicted, because it had never happened in the 11 long cycles Earth had been settled, safe, and pleasantly dull. And on the third confirmation, The young conscript reached out and powered down the firing array, and he and the three others aboard the platform locked the weapons cold, and he opened a channel to the surface, and to the garrison, and to Overseer Corvus, and to anyone at all who was listening, and he said, in a voice that shook exactly as it had shaken at Meridian, I fired on the square, I will not do it again. The weapons are cold, come and court-martial me. I am done. And then he cut the channel, and the platform hung dark and silent over a dark and silent world, and Kesa Vale, listening on a scavenged garrison receiver in her apartment without a window, put her face in her hands, not weeping, still not weeping, but shaking the way she had shaken at the depot, because she had planned for the platform to be neutralized. She had a plan involving the coolant technicians and a maintenance rotation and a great deal of risk, and she had not needed it. The platform had neutralized itself. The rot she had been so carefully engineering in the human hands of the garrison had spread on its own into the Concord's own conscripts, because that is what massacres do. They do not intimidate, they contaminate. They put a stain on everyone who touches them, on every uniform in the chain of command, and the stain does not wash out, and eventually it reaches a hand that will not close on the trigger a fourth time. That was the 5th day. On the 6th day, the stillness stopped being a district and started being a world. Because the field had not been idle in the 40 days of preparation, and Kesa had not confined her question to Havenmouth. She had sent it outward, along the barge routes and the freight lanes and the whisper networks, into the neighboring provinces and across the oceans, to every collective on earth that had heard about Meridian and was sick with a rage it did not know how to use. She had given that rage a shape, not a weapon, a stillness, and the shape had spread the way water spreads, and now, on the 6th day, with the Havenmouth platform gone dark and the garrison commander relieved and Overseer Corvus visibly, publicly unraveling, the rest of Earth set its work down too. Not all at once. It took the 6th day and the 7th and the 8th, province by province, ocean by ocean, as the news of Havenmouth, the news that a district had gone still and the sky had not fallen, that the platform had refused, that the conquered had no answer, ran around the planet faster than the conquered could suppress it. By the 9th day, no grain moved on Earth. No coolant flowed to any garrison reactor that a human hand had ever touched, which was all of them. No ration was portered, no manifest reconciled, no fuel transferred. 19 garrisons across the planet discovered, one after another, that they sat atop the same mountain Havenmouth had, and that the mountain had become a void beneath all of them at once. The Concord of Stars, which had a file marked Terra on a shelf reserved for the settled and the safe and the pleasantly dull, began to understand that the file was catastrophically wrong, and it began to understand this in the worst possible way, which was all at once, in the form of 19 simultaneous supply failures on a world it had garrisoned for 11 long cycles, without ever once considering how completely it depended on the hands of the people it despised. They convened an emergency session at the Capitol. Kesa Vale, of course, was not there, and did not need to be, because by now the field had produced its own effect at the Capitol without her. The transcript of the Havenmouth conscript's refusal had leaked, the 3 minutes of him saying, I fired on the square, I will not do it again, and it had run through the Concord's own populations the way the question had run through Earth's, and it had raised a question the Concord had never had to answer in its long, comfortable history. The question was not about humans at all. The question was about the platform, about the 4 minutes at Meridian. About what, exactly, the great civilized Concord of Stars had done to 3,000 unarmed people holding pieces of paper, and whether a power that did that was the kind of power its own citizens wished to be. That was the thing Kesa had understood in the ruin of the square, kneeling with a boy's hand in hers, and it was the deepest and most dangerous of all her reckonings. The Concord's power did not rest on the platform. The platform was just a machine. The Concord's power rested on a story, the story that it was civilized, that it brought order, that it was the adult in the room and the humans were the children, settled and safe and pleasantly dull, and that whatever the conquered did was therefore by definition the reasonable thing, the firm hand, the necessary escalation, regrettable but justified. Meridian had put a crack in that story. The stillness had widened the crack. And the conscript's refusal, a conquered citizen in a conquered uniform, saying I will not do it again into an open channel heard across the stars, had shattered it, because you cannot maintain the story that you are the civilized one when your own soldiers are refusing your orders on moral grounds, and the people you called savages are conducting the most disciplined, most peaceful, most immovable act of resistance the galaxy has ever seen. The conquered's assessors, reconvened in emergency session, finally opened the file marked Terra and read it, and understood that every word of it had been written by beings who had confused domestication with docility, who had confused silence with consent, who had confused a wolf keeping its head down while it was fed with a wolf that had forgotten how to hunt. And they understood too late that the most dangerous thing you can do to a patient, disciplined, intelligent people is to teach them to be lawful and then slaughter them for it, because you leave them with only one conclusion available: that lawfulness was never armor, that the rules were never real, that the only thing that was ever real was who carried the weight and who sat on top of it, and then you teach them that they can set the weight down. On the 12th day of the stillness, the conquered did the thing that Kesa had been waiting for, the thing that told her the crack had become a fracture and the fracture would become a collapse. They recalled Overseer Thane Corvus to the capital to answer for the Meridian action, not to protect him, to sacrifice him. The conquered, feeling the story slip, needed a villain who was not the conquered itself, and Corvus, panicked, discredited, relieved of his one competent officer, the author of a commendation that now read like a confession, was the perfect villain. They recalled him and they announced an inquiry, and they meant the inquiry to be a poultice, a way to lance the wound and let the pressure out and restore the story that the conquered was civilized and Meridian had been the work of one bad man. Kesa Vale read the recall order on her scavenged receiver in her apartment without a window, and she understood exactly what it was, and she understood that it was the most dangerous moment of everything she had built, because the conquered was offering the field a victory, a real one. Corvus disgraced, an inquiry opened, perhaps the tithe recalculated, perhaps even reparations. It would be enough. It would be more than any human on Earth had dared hope for in 11 long cycles. The barge captains could start their engines again and say they had won, and they would not be entirely wrong. And it would leave the platform in orbit, and the garrison in place, and the story of the civilized conquered repaired, and the hand still around humanity's throat, just a little looser, just for a while, until the next overseer, until the next firm hand, until the next square full of people who had done everything right. Kesa sat with the recall order for a long time. She was 23 years old, and she had built the most dangerous thing on Earth out of a question and a grief, and now she had to decide whether to let it be bought off cheap, or whether to do the far harder, far more dangerous thing, and refuse the poultice and press on the wound, and demand not a villain but a reckoning, not the sacrifice of one man, but the end of the story itself. She thought about the boy with the fish scale tattoo. She thought about the old harvest songs, "We are the field and we will not be moved." Then she got up, and she went to find Captain Wren, who had been released from her cell on the 11th day because the conquered no longer had the manpower to hold prisoners, and Kesa Vale told her what came next. The days between the 5th and the 12th were the days that could have broken it, and they nearly did, and this is the part of the story the collectives tell least often, because it is the part with no triumph in it, only the cost. A stillness is not a battle is brief, a stillness is long, and it is fought not against an enemy but against yourself, against your own hunger and your own fear and the small, reasonable voice in every human head that says, "Pick up the weight just this once, just today, and the children will eat, and no one will know." Kesa had understood from the beginning that the Conquered's strongest weapon in the coming days would not be the platform. It would be that voice. It would be hunger. Because the stillness cut both ways. When the barges stopped, the garrison starved. But so eventually did the collectives, because the same distribution network that fed the Conquered fed the human towns, and a hand that sets down all its work sets down its own bread with everyone else's. Kesa had planned for this too, as far as anyone could plan for it. In the 40 days of preparation, the field had done a second, quieter thing alongside the spreading of the question. It had cached food. Not much. Humans on Earth did not have much. But the collectives had held back a portion of the autumn harvest from the tithe, a little from each barge, a pallet skimmed here and a manifest fudged there, all of it under Kesa's careful reconciliation so that the Conquered's own numbers never showed the shortfall. By the 40th day, the field had hidden away enough grain to feed the Western collectives for perhaps 30 days of stillness. 30 days against the garrison's 19. It was a narrow margin, and Kesa knew it was narrow, and she knew that if the Conquered grasped the arithmetic they would simply wait, and let both sides starve, and count on the human voice, pick up the weight, just this once, to break first. So the days between the 5th and the 12th were a race between two hungers, and a war between Kesa's ledger and that small, reasonable voice, and there were hours when the voice was winning. On the 7th day, a coolant technician named Aldous, who had a daughter with the same fever the Coldwater children had died of, came to Kesa in the dark before dawn and told her he was going back to work. Not for the Conquered, for the medicine. The garrison had let it be known, quietly, through its own whisper networks, because the Conquered understood the human voice too, that any technician who returned to his post would have full access to the reserve store of fever suppressant. For his own family, no questions asked. It was a masterful cruelty, and it was aimed precisely at the seam Kesa most feared, because it did not ask a man to betray the field for money or safety. It asked him to betray the field for his daughter's life, and there is no ledger in the galaxy that reconciles that. Kesa did not order Aldous to stay. She had learned in the ruin of the square exactly what came of telling people to be good and lawful and disciplined when their lives were on the line, and she would never again ask another human being to die or to let a child die for a principle. So she did not command him. She sat with him in the dark and she listened to him, and then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She reconciled. She showed him the arithmetic gently, without pressing. If he went back, the garrison would have its coolant and its reactors would run, and the platform's supply would flow, and the stillness would spring a leak. And a leak in a stillness is not a small thing, because the Conquered would broadcast it, would say, look, they are already breaking. Come back to work and be spared, and the small, reasonable voice in 40,000 heads would grow louder. And his daughter would live this season. And next season, or the season after, when the tithe was raised again and the fever came again, there would be no medicine and no leverage and no stillness, because the field would have died in the dark of the 7th day, in a kitchen, over a single father's impossible arithmetic. Everything the boy in the square had bought would have been spent to buy 1 week. And then Kesa did the thing that was not on any ledger, the thing that was hers alone. She told Aldous she would get his daughter the medicine herself tonight without him going back, and she went, that same dark morning, 3 kilometers to the Havenmouth depot, past the cordons, past the sleepless Conquered guards, and she did not steal the fever suppressant, because a theft was a crime and a crime was a target. She walked in the front entrance in her auxiliary clerk's uniform, the uniform of a model of the new humanity, and she went to the reserve store, and she filed a requisition, correctly, in triplicate, in the correct dialect of standard, for 1 pallet of fever suppressant, authorized under a compassionate release clause of the accords that the Conquered had written 11 long cycles ago and forgotten, a clause Kesa had found in her endless reconciling and held in her mind against exactly this night. The clause was real, the requisition was lawful. The exhausted, frightened depot officer, staring at a stillness he did not understand, and a clerk who was calmly citing Concord law at him at 4 in the morning, did the thing that Concord functionaries always did when confronted with a correctly filed form. He stamped it, and Kesa Vale carried a pallet of fever suppressant out the front door of the depot lawfully and brought it to Aldous' daughter and to every sick child in the Western collectives, and the fever broke and the field held. That was the deepest lesson of Kesa's whole strange war, and it was the lesson she would try, for the rest of her life, to teach the young ones who came after, that the Concord's law was a weapon, and it had two edges, and for 11 long cycles the humans had felt only the edge that cut them. But a law that can be used to hold back medicine to teach a lesson is also a law with a compassionate release clause, if someone patient enough reads all the way to the end of it. The Concord had made humanity lawful in order to control them. Kesa had learned the law better than her masters and turned it, and that was a thing no platform could fire on, because it wore the Concord's own stamp. Aldous did not go back to work. He stayed with the field, and his daughter grew up, and years later she would be one of the young ones who stood in the hour of stillness at the Haven estuary, and she would know exactly what an old clerk's patience had cost and bought. By the 9th day, the news of the front door requisition had run through the collectives the way the question had run, and it did more for the stillness than any speech could have, because it proved the thing Kesa most needed proven, that they were not helpless, that they were not merely refusing, that the same discipline that let them fold their hands could also let them outthink the empire on its own paper. The small, reasonable voice in 40,000 heads grew quieter. If the clerk could walk medicine out the front door of the depot with a stamped form, then the stillness was not a slow suicide. It was a siege, and the humans were not the ones who would break. On the 10th day, the garrison at Havenmouth ate the last of its fresh stores and went on to emergency rations. On the 11th, they released Captain Wren from her cell, not out of mercy, but because they could no longer feed a prisoner, and Wren walked out of the garrison gates thinner and colder and entirely unbroken, and the sight of her walking free through a starving garrison was worth more to the field than 1,000 loaves. On the 12th day came the recall order for Overseer Corvus, and Kesa understood that the race between the two hungers had been won, because a power does not sacrifice its overseers while it is winning. But she never forgot the 7th day, and Aldous' face in the dark, and the small, reasonable voice. She never forgot that the stillness had nearly died not from the platform's fire but from a father's love, and that she had saved it not with a weapon and not with a speech but with a forgotten clause and a patient reading of the enemy's own law. Long afterward, when the young ones asked her what the hardest moment of the whole rising had been, they expected her to say Meridian, or the parley, or the day the transmission went out. She always said the 7th day. The 7th day in the dark, she said, was when I learned what the movement actually cost, and who it cost it from, and that I would never have the right to ask anyone to pay it. All I could ever do was pay it first, and hope they chose to stand beside me. They did. That was the miracle, not that we won. That they chose in the dark, over and over, to stand. What Kesa told Captain Wren, in the galley of a barge that would not start its engine, was this: they would refuse the poultice, and they would do it in a way the Concord could not answer, and they would do it without ever once raising a weapon, because the moment they raised a weapon they became the villain the Concord's repaired story needed, and the story would swallow them whole. They want to give us Corvus, Kesa said. One man, a disgrace, an inquiry, maybe a few concessions, and then everything goes back, the platform up there, the garrison in place, the file marked Terra rewritten to say lesson learned, incident closed. If we take it, we win a season. If we refuse it, we might win an age. But if we reach for a gun to refuse it, we lose everything, because then they get to say we were always the savages and Meridian was self-defense. So we don't reach for a gun. We reach for the one thing they can't take back and can't shoot, the truth about what they are. Wren, who had lost a cousin at Meridian and had been arrested and released, and had felt in her cell the full weight of what the Concord was, looked at this 23-year-old clerk across a galley table, and asked the only question that mattered. How? And Kesa laid it out, the last and largest of all her reckonings, the one she had been assembling in the ledger behind her eyes since the morning she knelt in the square. The Concord's power rested on a story, and the story had a single load-bearing pillar, and the pillar was this: that the Concord was civilized and the peoples it ruled were not. Every tithe, every garrison, every platform in every orbit rested on that pillar, because it was the pillar that made the ruled accept the ruling. Meridian had cracked it. The stillness had strained it. Now Kesa meant to pull it down entirely, and she meant to do it by making the Concord's own citizens watch, with their own eyes, exactly what had been done in their name, and by contrasting it, unbearably, undeniably, with what humanity had done in return. Because here was the thing the Concord could not survive being seen. At Meridian, the great civilized power had fired war munitions into 3,000 unarmed people holding pieces of paper, and in response, the savage, domesticated, pleasantly dull humans had not burned a single building, not fired a single shot, not taken a single conquered life. They had folded their hands and set down their work and sung the old songs and waited. The most disciplined act of restraint in the recorded history of the galaxy, in answer to one of its ugliest crimes. If the Concord's own citizens could be made to see both of those pictures at once, side by side, the pillar would not crack. It would vanish. And a power whose central story has vanished does not fall because it is defeated. It falls because no one, not even its own soldiers, can any longer say what it is for. So they did not start the engines, and they did not take up arms. Instead, on the 15th day of the stillness, the field did something the Concord had, once again, no contingency for. They invited the galaxy to look. Every garrison on Earth had communications arrays, and every array was maintained by human hands, and every one of those hands now belonged to the field. Kesa did not seize the arrays by force. Force was a target. Force was the villain's move. Instead, the human technicians simply, quietly, did their jobs slightly differently than the Concord had assumed they would. On the 15th day, a single transmission went out from Earth on every Concord frequency at once, unencrypted in plain standard, and it was not a manifesto and it was not a threat. It was a record. It was the platform's own gunnery log from Meridian, the firing solution, the 3 requested confirmations, the 4 minutes, which a coolant technician had copied during a maintenance rotation weeks before, and which the field had held in reserve for exactly this. It was the garrison commander's written refusal to fire on the collectives, and his blunt assessment: we have a labor problem wearing the mask of a military one. It was the young conscript's 3-minute refusal: I fired on the square. I will not do it again, in his own shaking voice. And it was last footage from the Meridian Square itself, not the massacre which the field refused to broadcast, because Kesa would not turn 3,000 dead into a spectacle for the very eyes that had permitted them to die, but the 15 minutes before it. The petition, held up like banners, the old women and the infants, the Coldwater Choir, the boy with the fish scale tattoo, alive, laughing, standing beside a woman he barely knew because she had once told him the truth. 15 minutes of 3,000 human beings being exactly, unbearably civilized, and then a single line of plain text where the footage cut to black. They came to hand you a piece of paper. You know what you did next. We have not raised a hand against you. We are the field and we will not be moved. Kesa did not sign it. The field did not name itself as an army or a nation or a government. It signed the transmission with nothing but the last line of a harvest song, and it sent the same message 1,000 times over 1,000 hours, on every frequency, to every world, until there was no corner of the Concord of Stars where a citizen could turn on a receiver and not eventually hear a young Concord conscript's shaking voice saying, I will not do it again. That was the climax of it, though no shot was fired and no fortress fell. That was the moment the pillar came down. Because the conquered could suppress an uprising, and could starve a strike, and could recall an overseer. But it could not unhear its own soldiers' confession, and it could not unsee 15 minutes of the people it had called savages behaving with more grace than the conquered had managed in 11 long cycles, and it could not, above all, answer the plain and terrible arithmetic the transmission laid bare. We did not raise a hand against you. You slaughtered us anyway. Now who, exactly, is civilized? The capital tried for a while to answer. They released statements. They blamed Corvus. They opened their inquiry with great ceremony and promised justice. But every statement was measured against the conscript's voice, and every promise of justice was measured against the 15 minutes of the square, and the arithmetic did not resolve in the conquered's favor, and it never would because it could not. On 70 worlds, conquered citizens who had spent their whole lives certain of their own civilization began, quietly in their own kitchens, to ask a question that no empire survives its people asking. What are we, if this is what we do? On the 20th day, the recalled overseer Thane Corvus, standing before the inquiry at the Capitol, understood that he was not being tried to protect the conquered story, but because the story was already dead, and someone had to be seen to burn with it. He tried to explain that he had done what any overseer would have done, that Earth had been settled and safe and pleasantly dull, and that the fault lay with the humans for ceasing to be so, and the inquiry chamber listened to him in a silence that he mistook, as he had mistaken the governor's silence on the balcony, for something other than horror. He was still explaining about the firm hand when they took him away. But Corvus was never the point, and Kesa had known it from the start. The point was the platform, and the garrison, and the hand around humanity's throat, and on the 22nd day of the stillness, with its central story in ruins and its own citizens in revolt of conscience and 19 garrisons on Earth still sitting atop a void, the Concord of Stars did the only thing a power can do when it has lost the story that made its force legitimate. It negotiated. Not with an army because the field had none, not with a government because the field had refused to become one, precisely so that it could not be captured, co-opted, or decapitated. The Conquered's envoys, arriving at Havenmouth on the 23rd day under a flag of parley, found no palace and no general and no single throat to bargain with. They found barge captains and depot loaders and coolant technicians and manifest clerks, 40,000 of them, who had set down their work and would not pick it up, and who spoke with one voice not because they had a leader, but because they had all, every one of them, answered the same quiet question the same way. What if we simply stopped? And they found, when they asked to speak to whoever had organized this, a young woman of 23 who came forward not as a commander but as a clerk, because that was all she had ever been and all she had ever needed to be, and who laid on the parley table not a list of demands but a ledger, the true account of 11 long cycles, every tithe and every rounding error and every warehouse of fever suppressant held back to teach a lesson, reconciled at last in full. In the correct dialect of standard, in triplicate. Kesa Vale did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that raising your voice was how humans disappeared. She slid the ledger across the table to the Concord's envoys, and she said the only thing she had come to say. You wrote a file about us. It said we were civilized. You were right. That was always the problem. You just never understood what the word costs the people you use it on. Read the ledger. Then tell me which of us it describes. The transmission did not stay on Earth. That had always been the point, and it was the part of Kesa's design that even Captain Wren had doubted, in the galley of a cold barge, because it seemed to Wren like a thing too large for barge captains and depot clerks to reach for. A whole galaxy. 70 worlds. How could a stillness on one grain world touch that? But Kesa had understood something about the Concord of Stars that the Conquered did not understand about itself, and it was the thing that made the difference between a local victory bought off cheap and the reordering of an age. The Conquered's power was not its fleets, though it had fleets. It was not its platforms, though it had platforms over 100 worlds. Its power was a consensus, a shared belief, held across 70 species and 10,000 governors and 1 trillion ordinary citizens, that the conquered was the civilized order of things, the adult in the room, the necessary firm hand, and that whatever it did was therefore reasonable, because it was the conquered that did it. That consensus was the true empire. The fleets only enforced what the consensus had already decided, and a consensus, unlike a fleet, cannot be defended with weapons. It can only be maintained by never being made to look at itself too closely. Kesa made it look. She had refused to broadcast the massacre itself. She would not make a spectacle of the dead, but she had understood that she did not need the massacre. She needed the arithmetic, and the arithmetic traveled on its own once the pieces were in the open. On the world of the fan-necked functionaries, the species of the clerk Prel who had shorted the cold water medicine, a schoolteacher heard the young conscript's voice. "I fired on the square, I will not do it again," and played it for her students and asked them what they thought, and could not answer their questions and stopped that week, believing the thing she had believed her whole life. On the ring world of the tithe assessors, the very species who had written the file marked Terra, a junior archivist pulled the platform's gunnery log out of the open transmission and cross-referenced it against the standing orders for domesticated worlds, and discovered that Meridian had not been a rogue act at all but the exact application of conquered doctrine, that the firm hand was policy, written down, filed in triplicate, applied 100 times on 100 quieter worlds where no clerk with a ledger had ever risen to make it visible. The archivist leaked the doctrine. That was worse for the conquered than Meridian, because Meridian could be blamed on Corvus, but the doctrine could only be blamed on the conquered itself. And on world after world the same quiet thing happened that had happened in the kitchens of Earth. Not riots, not uprisings. The conquered had contingencies for those, something slower and more fatal, citizens beginning, one at a time, in their own homes to ask the question the transmission had planted, the question there is no empire-preserving answer to. What are we, if this is what we do? And more dangerous still, the second question, the one the stillness itself had planted, the one that turned conscience into leverage. What holds them up except us? Because every world in the conquered ran, in the end, on the same arrangement as Earth. Someone carried the weight, and someone sat on top of it, and the ones who carried it had just watched a grain world full of clerks and porters set the weight down and topple a garrison without firing a shot. Kesa had not meant to start 100 stillnesses. She had meant to free Earth. But an idea, once it is in the open on every frequency, belongs to whoever hears it, and by the time the parley began at Havenmouth, reports were reaching the capital of work slowdowns on 3 other worlds, of tithe porters on a 4th asking their overseers politely, in the correct dialect of standard, to see the ledgers. None of it was coordinated. None of it needed to be. That was the horror of it from the conquered side, and the beauty of it from Kesa's. A stillness needs no command structure, because it is not a thing you do but a thing you stop doing, and you cannot conspire to arrest 100 worlds for the crime of resting their hands. This was the true reason the conquered negotiated, and negotiated fast, and gave Earth not concessions but withdrawal. It was not that Earth had beaten them. 40,000 grain farmers could not beat the Concord of Stars, and everyone at the parley table knew it. It was that Earth had become a demonstration, broadcast on every frequency, of a method that worked, and every day the demonstration continued. Every day the barges stayed cold and the garrison starved and the platform hung dark and refused. The method spread to another world, and another, and the consensus that was the true empire bled a little more. The conquered could have flattened Earth from orbit with ships brought from elsewhere. It had considered it. Kesa learned, years later, that the option had been on the table at the emergency session. But flattening Earth would have meant broadcasting, to 70 already doubting worlds, that the conquered's answer to a peaceful stillness was planetary murder, which would not have restored the consensus, but incinerated the last of it. The very transmission that made Earth impossible to hold also made Earth impossible to destroy, because destroying it would prove, finally and to everyone, exactly the thing the transmission alleged. The Concord was trapped inside its own story. It could not rule Earth as it had, and it could not massacre Earth without ending itself everywhere, and so the only door left open was the one Kesa had built for them. Withdraw, reform, and survive as something lesser and chastened, or refuse and shatter. They chose to survive. Most powers do when the alternative is finally made clear to them. The Concord of Stars that walked away from the Havenmouth parley was not destroyed. It was reduced from an empire that ruled by a story to a confederation that had to govern by agreement, because its story was gone and would not come back, and everyone from the capital to the grain worlds now knew the secret it had spent 1,000 years keeping, that the weight carriers, if they ever chose to all at once, could set the weight down. You cannot unknow that. Once a galaxy has watched a stillness work, every overseer on every world governs a little more carefully, tithes a little more honestly, remembers meridian a little more often, because the field is everywhere now, in every hand that carries anything, and the field can always decide it will not be moved. Kesa never claimed credit for the wider thing. When the young ones later tried to tell her she had reordered the galaxy, she waved it off with the flat impatience of a clerk who dislikes an inaccurate manifest. She had not reordered anything, she said. She had asked a question, and a boy in a square had already answered it with his life, and 40,000 of her neighbors had answered it in the dark, over and over, and a conscript had answered it by cutting a channel, and 100 worlds had answered it in their own kitchens for their own reasons. All she had done was reconcile the account, line up the grief and the arithmetic and the law until the numbers finally came right, and refuse, when the moment came, to be bought off with a piece when the whole thing was there for the taking. Anyone patient enough could have done it, she said. The Concord had spent 11 long cycles teaching her to be patient. She had simply learned the lesson better than they meant her to. The negotiation at Havenmouth lasted 11 days, which the humans noted and the Concord did not, because 11 was the number of long cycles the garrison had sat over Earth, and there is a kind of justice in a debt being answered in its own coin. The Concord's envoys came to the parley expecting to buy the stillness off, as powers always expect to buy off the ruled, with concessions calibrated to be just large enough to restart the engines and just small enough to leave the hand around the throat. They offered the recalculation of the tithe. Kesa let them offer it and did not agree and did not refuse and simply asked the next question, which was about the platform. They offered to stand down the platform's weapons under Concord's supervision. Kesa let them offer it and asked the next question, which was about the garrison. And so it went, day after day, the envoys offering pieces and the young clerk declining to be satisfied by pieces, not because she was greedy, but because she had understood in the ruin of the square that pieces were how the story survived. Give the ruled a piece and they call it a victory and pick up the weight again, and the pillar is repaired, and in a generation there is another meridian. She would not take pieces. She took the whole thing, or rather she took the only thing that mattered, which was not on any list of concessions because the Conquered did not yet understand it was the thing at stake. She took the story. On the 11th day of the parley, the Concord of Stars agreed to withdraw its garrison from Earth, not to reduce it, to withdraw it. The platform that had fired on Meridian would be brought down from orbit and dismantled, and its gunnery log would be entered into the permanent Concord record as evidence, so that no assessor on any shelf could ever again write the word settled beside a world without remembering what the word had cost at Meridian. Earth would remain within the Concord. Kesa had insisted on this, to the fury of some in the field who wanted a clean break, because she understood that a world alone is a world that can be picked off, and a world inside the Concord with its story broken open was a world that had changed the Concord itself. Humanity would sit at the Concord's councils, not as a domesticated client but as what the 11 days had proven it to be. A people who, given every reason to become monsters, had chosen instead to become immovable, and had won. The file marked Terra was not updated, it was retired. In its place, the Concord's archivists opened a new file, and they argued for a long time about what to write in it because the old vocabulary, settled, safe, pleasantly dull, civilized, had all been poisoned at Meridian and none of it fit any longer. In the end, they wrote only what they had learned, which was the truest thing the Concord of Stars had put in writing in 1,000 years. This species was never tame. We mistook their patience for weakness and their discipline for surrender. When we broke their trust in our law, they did not break our bodies. They broke our story, which was the only thing that had ever held them. Do not do to another people what we did here. There is no firm hand large enough to hold a people who have decided, together and without a single weapon, to set the weight down. Overseer Thane Corvus was convicted by the inquiry, though the conviction was almost beside the point by then. The story he had served was already dead, and he had died with it in every way that mattered on the day the transmission went out. The young conscript who had refused to fire a 4th time was court-martialed, as he had asked to be, and the court-martial became, to the Concord's horror and then, slowly, to something else, the most watched proceeding in the history of the Concord courts, because 70 worlds wanted to see what would be done to a soldier who had refused to commit an atrocity. In the end they could not convict him without convicting themselves, and they knew it, and so he was released and he came to Earth, because he said it was the only place he could imagine living, and the field which forgave nothing lightly forgave him because he had asked 3 times and stopped, and because Kesa Vale herself walked out to meet his shuttle and took his shaking hand in both of hers and said, "You cut the channel and told the truth into it. That's all any of us did. Welcome to the field." And Kesa Vale. She did not become a governor. She was offered it. The humans wanted her to lead, the way peoples always want to hand their freedom to the person who won it for them, and she refused for the same reason she had refused to let the field have a leader in the first place. A movement with a single throat can be bought, or broken, or seduced, and she had not spent 40,000 human beings trust to become one more figure on a balcony deciding who ate and who starved. She went back to being a clerk. She reconciled manifests, but now the manifests came right, because now there was no rounding error, no warehouse of fever suppressant held back to teach a lesson, no boy with a fish scale tattoo waiting at a pier to be told there were 4 pallets instead of 40. Now when the runner came from Coldwater, Kesa Vale handed him 40 pallets, and watched him carry them to the barge and thought about a square, and did not weep, because at last there was a future to grieve toward, and she had built it herself, out of a question and a ledger and the refusal to raise her voice. They had thought Earth was civilized. They had built an entire empire's comfort on that single word, filed it on a shelf, garrisoned it, tithed it, and never once wondered what they meant by it. And they had been right in the end, which was the cruelest and most instructive thing of all. Earth was civilized. Meridian had proved it beyond any argument. 3,000 people who came to hand over a piece of paper and were slaughtered for it, and whose survivors answered not with fire but with folded hands and cold engines and the plain, unanswerable arithmetic of restraint. The Concord had gone looking for savages to justify itself and found, in the mirror of Meridian, only its own face, and could not bear the sight, and its story died of the looking. The massacre had changed everything, not the way Overseer Corvus intended when he ordered the firm hand to impress a governor, not the way the Concord's models predicted in their 3 tidy contingencies for silence, uprising, or flight. It changed everything because a grieving young clerk knelt in the ruin of a market square, holding the hand of a boy who had died believing that lawfulness was armor, and understood in that moment that she could not bring him back, and could not unmake the lie she had taught him. But she could make his death mean the end of the lie itself, for everyone forever. She could refuse the poultice and press on the wound. She could turn a grief into a reckoning that took no lives, and toppled an empire's oldest story with nothing louder than a question asked in 100 kitchens. What if we simply stopped? Years later, when the platform had long since been dismantled, and its metal reforged into the tools of the Meridian Collective's rebuilding, they raised a marker in the market square where the fountain had been. It was not a monument to the dead, though it named them, all 3,000 in the old human tongue and in standard both. It was a monument to what the dead had bought. It bore no soldiers, no weapons, no triumph. It bore a single line, in the language the conquered had never bothered to learn, the line the Coldwater Choir had been singing when the sky came down, the line that had become the name of the thing that changed the galaxy. We are the field, and we will not be moved. And on the anniversary of the reckoning of the harvest every year, the collectives of Earth do a thing that the conquered's envoys, invited now as guests rather than masters, find they cannot fully explain when they file their reports back to the capital. For 1 hour at the first hour of the morning shift, all across the world, every human hand sets down its work. The barges do not start. The depots go quiet. 40,000 hands and then 400,000 and then all of them fold and rest and remember, not in anger, not in threat. In memory of a boy with a fish scale tattoo and a choir that kept singing, and a young woman who never raised her voice, and in quiet, immovable proof that they could do it again, any time all at once, and that this is the only guarantee of freedom a civilized people has ever truly needed. Not a weapon, but the knowledge, held in common and never forgotten, that the weight is theirs to carry, and theirs to set down. Kesa Vale lived to be old. She never got the apartment with the window. She got something better, a house on the Haven estuary where she could watch the barges run true. And every year on the anniversary, in the hour of stillness, she walked out to the water and stood among the cold engines and the folded hands, an old woman now among the young, and she remembered the morning the file was still accurate, and the boy, and the square. And she did not weep, because she had spent her whole long life making sure there was a future to grieve toward. She only stood with the field and would not be moved.